Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you on the Radio Northwest Network, and this segment brought to you by Nick Shivers. Find the details at nickshivers.com. I want to talk about the biggest choke point on America's major artery along its west coast, and that is Interstate 5. It effectively runs all the way from Canada to Mexico along the west coast of America. And along that entire route of almost, 2,000 miles or 1,500 miles, the biggest single choke point is the Interstate Bridge. And they plan to rebuild the bridge, except they plan to rebuild it the same size, and traffic congestion is going to get worse. Now, most of the legacy media, the TV stations, the daily dead fish wrapper newspapers, they're not going to tell you that. But our friend John Lee, who's a reporter, he's also a candidate for Washington House of Representatives District 18, position 2. And he's a retired airline pilot, so he knows about transportation, but just at much faster speeds than Interstate 5 offers. John, welcome back to the program.
Hey, Lars, thanks for having me on. And yes, I was in mass transit at about 700 miles an hour over the years, and privileged to do so.
Well, I want to talk about this. There are so many scams tied up in this bridge. But first, I want to remind people, John brought us the fact that they're going to build a brand new bridge to replace a bridge with 3 lanes each way, north and south, with a bridge that has 3 lanes each way, north and south, and where 54% of the surface of that bridge, where you drive, is going to be occupied by transit, bicycles, and pedestrians, and less than half of it is going to be set aside for cars and trucks and people who actually commute. So it's a scam that way. But you identified another scam in which the transit agency in one state, TriMet in Portland, is trying to fleece the people of Southwest Washington with the sale of these light rail vehicles. And would you mind describing that for the people listening?
Fleece is the perfect word, my friend. Greg Johnson and his Interstate Bridge team defend TriMet's demanding, number one, 19 brand new light rail vehicles as part of this $2 billion, 1.9-mile light rail extension into Vancouver. That's 10 vehicles per mile. That on the surface is ridiculous. And then TriMet is also asking for triple the price tag of those vehicles. Earlier this year, TriMet paid $4.5 million each for 4 new light rail vehicles on their 10-mile Better Red extension. They're now demanding the Interstate Bridge Replacement Program pay between $10 and $15 million per vehicle. What an absolute ripoff of taxpayers. We asked Greg Johnson's team if they thought there was anything untoward or if this raised eyebrows, and they absolutely support it, and that's an even more ridiculous outrage. There truly appears to be no accountability in the oversight of the single largest public works program in the history of Portland.
Now, let me ask you this. So they want to charge triple for these vehicles, at least on paper. So they're basically going to overcharge Southwest Washington for a bunch of light rail vehicles. They want 19. They want the number that they want, 19 of them. So that means they're buying far more than they need. They're buying a whole bunch of vehicles to use on the rest of TriMet's system, and they want to charge the cost to Southwest Washington. I mean, it'd be like me saying, hey, John, why don't you go out and buy a new car? You can use it on Sundays. I'll use it the other 6 days of the week. That doesn't exactly work out for you, does it?
No, not at all. And this pattern has been repeated many times. Number one, if you look back at the history of TriMet buying light rail vehicles, these light rail cars that they currently have in their system, about 25 of them are at the end of their useful life. TriMet should have been planning to replace these for the last couple of decades, knowing they were going to be old and decrepit and no longer useful. Instead, they're trying to add these 19 vehicles onto the tax rolls of the payers of the federal government, Washington, and Oregon taxpayers in a ridiculous amount just in asking for the 19, and then they want to charge the program 3 times the price tag for each of them. And the thing that makes me the maddest is that when we ask the program team, doesn't this look ridiculous? Isn't there a reasonable oversight of this? And Greg Johnson and his team support it completely, and they said, well, our job's just to support for whatever the government agencies ask for.
And by the way, John, I've talked to other transit experts like Randall O'Toole who pointed out the entire system has problems because you can only cram so many trains through downtown Portland and the tracks per hour. And yet they always promise more than they can deliver. They claim, according to your reporting, you're going to have a light rail departure from Vancouver every 7.5 minutes, except there's no way for them to get that many trains out of Vancouver if they can't go down to either downtown Portland or other locations they would go to and then get back in the same amount of time. Does the physics of that work at all?
No, that's absolutely perfect. The real bottleneck for TriMet's light rail system is the steel bridge over the Willamette River. During rush hour, in the morning and in the evening, they have one train that has to slow down to 10 to 15 miles per hour, and they have one train every 90 seconds. There is absolutely no way they can add more trains on anywhere in the system. In order to deliver that 7.5-minute departure, they'd have to cut service elsewhere. Additionally, John Charles and the Cascade Policy Institute, for the better part of 2 decades, has documented these false promises constantly made by TriMet to deliver 7.5-minute service, and the best they can do is every 15 minutes. So that's another lie that is known. It's been well documented for decades, and yet the IBR team says, oh, that's not our problem.
Well, by the way, John, isn't it their problem in that, if I understand the rules right, when you go to the federal government and say we're going to build a up to $9 billion bridge, the states have maybe two and a half of that, but we want the feds to pay the other $6 or $7 billion at the top end. The federal government says, then you must tell us how many people you're going to move. And then they make false promises and say, we're going to move, and they give them a number, whatever number makes them happy and gets the $7 billion, knowing full well that they have no way of achieving that number. And then in theory, at least, the federal government can come back and say, you failed to reach the number you promised, give us the money back, can't they?
Exactly right. The Federal Transit Administration has rules declaring a default in a contract with any particular transit agency. And again, we have seen TriMet over and over make promises of 7.5-minute departures that they failed on both the yellow and their green MAX lines when they were created several decades ago. And so one of my hopes is that when Donald Trump gets elected, he will appoint responsible, business-minded people at both the Federal Highway Administration and the Federal Transit Administration, who then will come in and say, you have a history of making false promises. We're not going to give you the money you demand.
And by the way, the Coast Guard has still not said yes, and their yes is necessary. It is absolutely required to build it. That's John Lee. John, thanks very much. We'll get to your phone calls and emails in just a moment. Glad to have you with me. You're listening to the Lars Larson Show and the Radio Northwest Network.